It gives me great pleasure to bring Jim O'Neill on board now. Jim, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Jim, looks like some logic and some rationality is coming back into financial markets. Not that there is a ray of hope on the medical front that number of cases are getting either peaked out or number of recoveries are increasing. Markets are in a mood to celebrate.
Well, it does look as though the markets have settled into a pattern of trading the infection curve in the most developed countries. And it is very gratifying that in the past few days, both Italy and Spain, that of course have been the epicenter of the crisis in the developed world, look as though they've gone past the peak. And obviously that's important in itself, but I think it's also important because it sends a message to everywhere else that is behind, possibly including places like India, but certainly the United States and the UK, that you can get on top of this battle pursuing some version of what Spain and Italy have done, which gives an additional example to the many countries in North Asia that were earlier in the fight against this and seem to have got this thing under control. So I think it makes quite a lot of sense for the markets to have recovered in the way they have the past 24 hours, because it suggests that there is some end, at least to this stage of the battle against COVID-19.
Jim, the fact that the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has not recovered at all, what do you think it means, A, in the way how the political things would move, and B, how should one now view this in terms of the news on the virus?
So, as I think many fellow cabinet members have said in British media this morning, obviously it is very sad that the Prime Minister is seemingly not well for himself, his family, and for the country to have the Prime Minister in this position. But it is also true that it demonstrates to everybody here in the UK, if there was any doubts before, just how dangerous this disease is. And it should reinforce the message of the importance of where it's possible, that social distancing is important to get the first stage of this battle against coronavirus under some kind of control. And in many ways, I hope that that's the message that radiates around our own country and the rest of the world, particularly the developed world, over the next couple of days, because nobody is excluded from being vulnerable to this horrible virus.
Jim, parallels have been drawn by IMF, where IMF is saying that, look, the current crisis is as deep as what we saw in 2008 when the GFC crisis happened. Do you think it's the right comparison? Because what happened in 2008 was a financial meltdown, and thankfully this time around there is a lockdown and there is no meltdown. Yes, the global growth will get impacted, the way we do business will change, but this is a medical crisis which will have economic implications. This is not a financial crisis which will bring banks and institutions down.
I think it's very difficult to make any direct comparisons to 2008 or other ones before. This is close to 40 years that I've been so deeply involved in international economics and finance, so I've been through many crises, and there is none that this has parallels to, primarily for the reason you say, that this is an external crisis not driven from within the economic system. It's not because of an excess in economics, not seemingly, It's a health crisis. And the second thing to emphasize, stating the obvious, that much of the economic damage has been, in a strange way, deliberately done by our governments in forcing this blunt social distancing on us all. So that also gives some hope that when we can move to a less dramatic stage of social distancing, then perhaps we can get some parts of our economies recovering very quickly. And it's interesting, in the past week, many Western forecasters have abandoned the idea of a V-shaped recovery, but that is not impossible in my opinion, especially because, of course, we've had an enormous monetary and fiscal stimulus in so many different countries, and we are probably going to get more over the past 24 hours. It looks to me as though an additional $1 trillion is going to come out of the United States. So it's not entirely impossible. There are many, many complicating factors, but it's not impossible that we could get a strong recovery in the second half of this year and beyond. But it's obviously very early days to talk about that with any kind of confidence, but it's not impossible.
Sure. Jim, you talked about stimulus. I just want to focus on India for a moment, because while we have, of course, had these big bang measures announced by several other countries, India is lagging behind. And yes, it's an emerging market. Maybe it doesn't have that kind of ammunition. But do you still feel perhaps that, the government will come out with a concrete plan? What is the risk to the economy if they don't?
So, excuse my thinking live as we talk, and you ask me that question. I found myself thinking overnight about the knock-on consequences for much of the emerging world, and for the sake of it, let's regard India as part of that now. Although obviously, given the size of India and its importance, that's possibly not applicable. But I think there are two separate issues, really. One is, if we can stabilize Western financial markets and Western economies, that obviously in itself is exceptionally important to the emerging world. Linked to what we just talked about briefly before, the scale of the economic decline in high-frequency indicators for March in Europe and the United States are truly dramatic, and indeed worse, more severe than 2008. And if we can stop that decline and have some hope of some kind of recovery in a few months' time, that in itself is extremely important for the economies and financial systems and financial markets of the rest of the world. The second thing, of course, is the infection spread within many countries, such as India, that seem to be, at least in time, lagged from the rest of us. And given the nature of Indian society, I suspect you obviously can't apply social distancing in the same blunt way that has been applied across Europe and in the United States, because you have so many people, particularly in your urban areas, that live and exist in such closely knit circumstances every day. But let me also add, as a third thing, of course, we don't know, and this is also a bit lost in the past week, we don't know whether it is still the case that because of warmer climates and different temperatures, whether this infection rate will hit so many parts of the southern hemisphere now as it has done in the northern hemisphere. That was something 2 months ago was widely believed to insulate many parts of the southern hemisphere, and that's sort of been forgotten in the past week, but we don't actually know that yet. And so, you know, we're going to have to see that. One other thing I think is important to mention, and I have been and I remain involved in this. I was on a call related to it just yesterday afternoon, British time. What happens with our G20 policymakers in terms of coordinated policies, particularly in terms of being able to finance and introduce important therapeutics and diagnostics, including tracing and testing, in an equitable basis to the world as a whole, including India, I think remains not only vital, but possibly even more important than the path to try and accelerate a usable vaccine in the next few weeks. Because if we could get our G20 leaders to agree a joint plan, that could give enormous credibility to how we might have a phased out move away from social distancing.
Okay, so Jim, let's take a look at the best and worst case scenarios here, given that everything is still so uncertain. As of now, companies were preparing for a quarter or 2 quarters of disruption. Now things are starting to look even more serious, and of course we've had several downgrades on whether it's on the equity markets and the index targets, as well as, of course, calls that this is going to be one of the worst global recessions we've seen in our lifetime. In your opinion, give us a sense of the extent that we could see this recession last in terms of timeline, and also how deep you feel the impact could be, particularly for emerging markets like India.
So let me start by saying, I honestly have no idea, and I don't think any of your guests should try to express too confidence, and I encourage all your viewers to be skeptical of anybody that does, because we don't know. And at the most basic, even our infectious disease specialists, some of which I was on this call with yesterday, don't really know that much about this horrible disease yet. So we don't really know how it will end. Second thing to say is, obviously, notwithstanding what I've just said, what's really going to get us beyond this is a vaccine. And right now, the vaccine specialists, I'm led to believe there's at least 62 interesting projects going on, maybe as many as double. Of them, about 8 appear to be very promising. It's generally assumed it's going to take 12 months, maybe longer, but it's not impossible, based on some things that I hear, that we could have a vaccine more like 9 months' time. So ultimately, I would think that we can't talk about getting completely beyond this until we have a vaccine that's being produced in sufficient quantities to protect everybody all over the world, all 8 billion of us. And so some aspects of future economic growth and future earnings for companies are subject to that. However, and now let me contradict myself slightly, as I touched on earlier, particularly given the policy stimulus and more stimulus I suspect that we'll get, we will probably experience some kind of significant recovery from where we are today in the developed world, I think, in the second half of this year. And that will feel possibly as though we're going to come out of this in a V-shaped way. But I'm going to contradict myself again, because linked to what I've just said about a vaccine and whether there's a second and third stage era of infection, we have all those uncertainties too. And it's very difficult to see things like airline travel and international tourism reappearing in the same sort of normal manner that we were all enjoying and participating in as recently as 3 months ago. Other forms of economic life, however, and new forms of economic life may appear in the meanwhile. Obviously, a lot of online-based businesses are thriving in this environment. In addition, a very interesting story, which doesn't surprise me, in the UK over the weekend, the whole role of local neighbourhood shops, retail stores, is seeing a whole resurgence of life that we've not seen in the UK for 30 years or longer, something that obviously India, outside of its major cities, thrives on. And this could be a bigger form of economic development going forward than in the past. And there are many, many other examples that I could say. And one final thing to say that you may want to ask me more about is, this comes against the background of two big issues that were slowly becoming more and more in the focus of whole global economic and social debates about the fight against climate change, and the other one being what I'd call inclusive capitalism, and in the middle of that, for business, profit with purpose. And I suspect governments, having intervened in so many economies here, will now have some experience of possibly using their own role as governments to help more strongly in the fight against climate change going forward. And they may want to, therefore, have bigger influence over what our airline and auto companies do, for example. And many things like that.
Okay. All right, Jim, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. But it was great to get your perspective as things unfold, and also to hear you clearly say that, it's really at the moment a lot of moving parts till we figure out the exact implications of this period.